Hello, listeners. This is Delve, a management podcast from McGill University where we want to change how you think about management. So my name's Eric Dicaire. I'm Delve's managing editor, and today we're getting an inside look at a fascinating field, humanitarian logistics operations. So our guest today, Professor Harwin de Vries of the Rotterdam School of Management, says humanitarian logistics is like planning the Olympic Games, but without knowing where it will take place and how many people are going to be affected. So this is the challenge that humanitarian organizations face every day. So in this interview, Professor de Vries will walk us through the main challenges of humanitarian logistics, how we might make it more efficient, and why operational innovations from the private sector may not be helpful during humanitarian emergencies. So Anicet Fangwa, an assistant professor of strategy and organization here at McGill University, has graciously stepped in to guest host today's podcast. So here he is interviewing Professor Harwin de Vries about humanitarian logistics. So let's delve into it.
Hi, Professor Harwin de Vries. Welcome to the Delve podcast. I'm so happy and thrilled to have you here and be able to engage in this conversation. And I would like to start with a more of a personal question. Your work and your research focus so much on maternal health and humanitarian logistics. And when I was reading your papers, at some point I was like, okay, how did you end up here? What push you into that direction? What is the motivation and what is it that you try to accomplish with your research?
Oof, that's a long story. So I kind of bumped into it when I was still a master's student. So I have a background in econometrics and operations research. I started to do an internship at a company, and they had a project in the field of humanitarian logistics where I was put up. And that was really the moment I realized, hey, I can do something with my quantitative background, not just to make profits, but actually to address some of the big problems in supply chains in the humanitarian sector and in the health sector. So that really inspired me. And when I got the opportunity to do a PhD as well, that was immediately clear for me, like, hey, this is what I want to focus on for the rest of my academic career.
I'm very encouraged by that because I have similar perspective on it. It's the exact same reason as feeling and looking at the impact that you can actually have with your research. From your perspective and looking at the state of the humanitarian logistic today, what would you say are the biggest pain point or the most hot topic that we need to address right now?
So humanitarian logistics is by itself extremely complex. Right? So the logistics behind the delivery of humanitarian assistance is oftentimes compared with having to organize the Olympic Games without knowing where it will take place, without knowing when it will take place, without knowing how many people will be affected. And so it's impossible to do that, but still, for humanitarian organizations, this is the type of situations they are facing, right? So at any point in time, the next big disaster can happen. They don't know where, they don't know when, they don't know how many people are affected, but still they need to be prepared. And so it's already very complex. But on top of that, there's an additional complexity, and that is that the needs are increasing very rapidly due to climate change, climate-related disasters, climate-related conflicts. And at the same time, if you look at resources that are available to address those needs, they are not really increasing. They are actually rather decreasing due to funding cuts by the US and other governments. Right, so organizations need to learn how to do more with fewer resources. Right, so that's the very big challenge that they are facing. So this is for the humanitarian sector, but also for the development sector, for health organizations that also tap into this funding pool.
Interesting. And you mentioned the lack of resources, and from my understanding and what we see on the ground is that usually there are three forces that are at play. You have the civil society, where, especially in the healthcare industry, the civil society wants as many patients to be treated as fast as possible, but you have the healthcare system itself who has limited resources. And at the same time, you have either the government or the donor who wants the metrics to sound good and to be able to raise extra money after that. And from your research, how are we able to balance those three demands and those three constraints?
Yeah, so this is, I would say, in general, in the humanitarian, in health and development, typical, right? You have multiple objectives and there's trade-offs. So one specific project, for example, where we had this was on network design for roadside healthcare facilities, right? So facilities that you put along highways in Africa to help truck drivers that who carry a lot of diseases and don't have access to doctors while they're working. And so there we had a problem of where do you put those facilities, right? And where you have multiple objectives like maximizing patient volume, right? Selecting locations that attract a lot of truck drivers versus also building a network that is kind of nicely spread out across Africa so that wherever a truck driver is, they are always close. So a trade-off here, the network that is the best in terms of patient volume is not necessarily the same as the network that is best in terms of this continuity of access, let's say. For decision makers that are facing these types of problems, I think it's good to realize that in many cases, the solution space is very big, right? And there are solutions that are close to optimal with respect to each of those objectives, right? So looking for those always makes sense, right? And that also is what we found in this specific work, right? There are networks that are good in terms of volume and also continuity of access. But the other thing is, in certain types of contexts, it's simply okay to prioritize one of the objectives. Right? So there are, also in this situation, cases where it's fine to just focus on patient volume, for example. And then, the third advice or direction to look into it would also be to use analytics. Right? So analytics allows for systematic trade-offs between different objectives. And that does not necessarily have to come in the form of very complex algorithms or something. It can also be in the form of something very simple. So again, referring to this example of network design, what we found out is that a very simple kind of scoring methodology can actually provide a tool to decision makers that allows them to very nicely trade off different objectives.
So at the end of the day, it's an optimization modeling problem, basically.
Yeah, it is an optimization modeling problem indeed, but it does not necessarily mean that we need advanced optimization approaches to actually solve that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm mentioning that because I also read your opinion paper with Professor Van Vassenhoff, where you argue that most optimization models in humanitarian logistics may actually be cost ineffective in practice. Could you explain why the disconnect happened and how can we solve it in the future?
Yeah, so the starting point for this project was the observation that if we look at commercial logistics, then advanced optimization approaches have really transformed the sector, right? So think about Amazon, think about FedEx, think about airline companies. And so while that has happened in that sector, if we now look at logistics in the humanitarian sector, even though logistics is huge, right, it represents about 70% of the costs that they are made in the supply chain, despite that, they are not really being applied over there. They're not really successful. So I know of just maybe a handful of successful applications of optimization models in, let's say, operational usages of those models in the sector. Right, so this is, of course, a bit strange, right? And people have been saying, it's because they are lagging behind, or it's because they don't have the expertise to build and implement those models. But what we are saying, hey, it might be true, but at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that in many cases, these models are simply not cost effective, right? The amount of benefit that you get out of those approaches in terms of better decisions may not justify the cost increase of implementing and using these types of methods. But because those costs, they are pretty significant. You need to implement the software, to maintain it. You need to train people, collect the data, and so forth. Whereas oftentimes, the types of problems that these are supposed to solve are either not too complex, let's say, so you don't need something very advanced, or the the algorithm would not have, let's say, the information that it would need to actually make better decisions than the current approaches.
You mentioned that the logistic industry has transformed with Amazon and FedEx. The fact that the humanitarian logistic has not transformed, is it because of a lack of incentive, or is it because, like you mentioned at the beginning, each crisis is so singular that the repeatability of your issue and the setting may not allow for something systemic and optimal like we would like it to be in academia?
Yeah, exactly. It's the latter indeed. And so if you look at the type of contexts, let's say the decision-making context in the humanitarian sector, it's oftentimes extremely decentralized, right? People in the field are making decisions. It's oftentimes such that the information that is needed to make decisions is oftentimes also locally available, right? And it's oftentimes such that you need to improvise indeed because of all those unknown unknowns that you run into. Now, if you compare that decision-making context with the type of context where, let's say, optimization approaches have been successful in business, it's completely the opposite. Right? You have not decentralized, but centralized decision-making. That centralized decision-maker has access to accurate information and does not really need to improvise a lot. Right? So you cannot directly transfer the approaches that work well in the commercial sector to the humanitarian sector because the realities are totally different.
But does it mean that we will never achieve optimality in the humanitarian sector?
So that in general, absolutely. We will always make a lot of mistakes because a good solution or the best solution can typically not really be identified beforehand because you lack the information to judge whether or not that solution is actually good. And the question is, are we able to do better than current methods of decision making, right? So the more experience, expertise, intuition-based methods of decision making. Right, and that is still an open question for me. Also, I'm still wondering in 20 years from now, will we have algorithms that are outperforming human decision makers in the field? But currently, I don't think we are at that point.
Interesting that you mentioned algorithm because AI is on the lips of everybody nowadays, and you also wrote an editorial piece about the fourth generation, the fourth industrial revolution, especially in the healthcare services. How do you see AI transforming the access to healthcare services, especially in low and middle income countries, and what are the risks that the use of AI in those contexts can actually produce?
So first of all, I'm not a very big AI expert. I'm more of an optimization person. But still, it's not hard to see that it has a huge potential, right? And the reason is simply that it helps partially address one of the fundamental problems, and that is that there is a lack of resources. So the number of doctors per 10,000 people in low-income countries is a factor of, I believe, 20, 30 lower compared to high-income countries. Right. So AI applications help partly become things make tasks more efficient, but also partly to shift some of the tasks of doctors or sometimes nurses to other healthcare personnel, or sometimes even to the patient. Right, so there's examples of AI-powered ultrasounds with which you can, with a minimum amount of training, actually perform the ultrasounds. Right, so that it helps alleviate part of the resource constraints that are present there. Of course, there's a risk, right, and it's the traditional risks that you hear about, right? So biases, AI being trained using examples from one context being applied to another one. But one of the bigger risks also here is that if they are designed in a way that people don't trust them or understand them, then the risk can be that they will not use them altogether. So this is the case for AI. It's also the case for optimization, right? So we should therefore also not only be talking about explainable AI, but also explainable analytics in general, or explainable optimization.
How important do you think it is to make sure that the introduction of new technology, especially in low-income and middle-income countries, is done with a concern about the local culture, the local philosophy, the set of beliefs that they have, and how do NGOs and organizations can actually build trust and autonomy and local knowledge in order to make sure that those technology are properly introduced?
So I would say it's extremely important. So it means the difference between a technology being used versus it not being used. So again, referring to the example of outreach teams, if we would have tried to sell or to implement an advanced decision support method that people would not understand, it would simply be a no-go for the organization, right? So the only way to really get this adopted was to make it very simple and understandable, and to align it with the decision-making culture. Right, so the decision-making culture in that organization was one indeed of autonomy, right? So people, the healthcare providers having a lot of autonomy in decision-making, having a lot of local knowledge. For example, where is there a market day, a vaccination campaign that we should take into account in our scheduling decisions? So they have the information and the autonomy. And if you put an algorithm on top of them that tells them what to do, that algorithm would not be appreciated by those healthcare people, but also would lack all that information that the teams would have, right? So the decisions we would get out of that would not potentially not be better than the decisions you would otherwise get.
And how do they actually build the trust that is necessary to convince the local population and the local people on the ground to use those technologies? So
in the end, the types of technologies, the decision support tools that we are working on in our research, they are the ones that need to be adopted by the people making the decisions, right? So let's say in this case of outreach teams, it would be the team leads using those types of methodologies to support, to make better decisions on which villages to visit, when to do that, and so forth. So how to build that trust? Well, I think the first step is don't try to replace their decision-making culture. But simply try to come up with something that supports, that feeds into their current decision-making culture and supports them making better decisions given that current situation, rather than implement a decision-making structure that may have worked well in commercial logistics, but may not at all work well over there. I think that's the key. Try to align with whatever is the culture and the decision-making context rather than replace it.
And looking ahead, where do you see the most urgent research needs in terms of health and humanitarian logistics? And how do you believe that operation research, which is your field, can make the greatest difference?
So what I started off with was saying that the sector needs to do more with less, right? So they really have a lot of urgency to become more effective and more efficient. So one approach is, of course, to follow the money, right? So first look at what are the categories of activities where we are simply spending most of our budgets, and then automatically you arrive at procurement. Right? So about 50% of the budgets of humanitarian organizations are going to procurement. And the way you do procurement has a huge impact on the prices you pay, of course, first of all, but also on how much time you're spending on procurement, but also on the impact that your activities are going to have in the field. Well, the second direction going forward is that we need to find out what are the types of contexts where we can support decisions using analytics, let's say, using processes and so forth, versus what are the type of contexts where we should leave decision making more to, let's say, the intuition-based, experience-based decision support methods. Right, so in my teaching, I always compared this as decision making using the cowboy approach, right, based on improvisation, gut feeling, and so forth, versus the bureaucrat, right, using processes and so forth. So the key questions are when to use the cowboy versus when to use the bureaucrat. How does that change over time? But also, can we perhaps come up with a way to combine best out of both worlds? And the third area where a lot of the work is needed is also to look at how can we change the constraints that are currently affecting the humanitarian sector. Right? So a lot of the work that has been done can be seen as kind of optimization given constraints. Right? So we take the system as it is, and we try, given the system, try to optimize decisions. But we don't need to necessarily take those constraints for granted, right?
Can you cite some example of constraints?
So these constraints can be like earmarking constraints, right? So constraints on you have to use the money for this specific disaster, right? Or constraints on, hey, you cannot share resources between different organizations because the money needs to be traceable to specific expenses that you are making as an organization. Constraints also in the form of what type of suppliers can you use, right? Due to all the requirements, financial due diligence and so forth. Many of those constraints are, let's say, well-intended, but have a lot of negative side effects that are really hurting the performance of humanitarian organizations. So this is really an area where I believe by generating evidence on the impact of those constraints and getting in touch with donors or the other actors setting those constraints, this is an area where we can make a lot of gain.
Thank you, Professor Harwin de Vries, for all those insights, and thank you for joining the Delve podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, that's a wrap. So that was Professor Anicet Fangwa stepping in as a guest host today, interviewing Professor Harwin de Vries from the Rotterdam School of Management. So a special thanks to them both. And if you liked hearing from Anicet, be sure to check out his other podcast too. It's called Leaders and Strategists. I'm going to leave a link in the description for you to check out. So be sure to also take a look at the Delve Podcast archive for even more great management interviews from McGill University. We've covered everything from healthcare management to sustainable finance, all completely for free, so you can keep learning and growing from our experts. So McGill Delve is the official thought leadership podcast of the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. Professor Anicet Fangwa was your host today. My name is Eric Dicaire. I'm the managing editor at Delve, and I produced, researched, and edited this episode. And Professor Saku Mantere is Delve's editor-in-chief, and he made all our original music. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.